Mary Ann Cotton entered the world in 1832 in the small village of Low Moorsley in County Durham, England, at a time when industrial life was harsh, uncertain, and unforgiving for the working classes. Her father, a coal miner, provided for the family as best he could, but the dangerous conditions of the mines and the instability of work meant survival was always a fragile thing. Life for a girl like Mary Ann was not gilded with opportunities or comfort. Instead, it was steeped in the realities of poverty, disease, and the constant shadow of death that hung over nearly every household in 19th century England. Infant mortality was common. Women often buried several of their children before they themselves reached middle age, and widows and orphans were hardly rare. To survive such an environment often required resilience, but in Mary Ann's case, her resilience would eventually take on a far darker shape. As a child, she was described as bright and neat, perhaps more polished than many of her peers. She received a modest education, which was uncommon for poor children, and she was known to attend Sunday school, learning her letters and the basics of reading and writing. Those who knew her at the time could not have imagined that this seemingly ordinary girl would grow into one of Britain's most infamous killers. Yet even in her early years, the circumstances of her life shaped a character that blended practicality, charm, and an unsettling disregard for the fragility of life. Her father's death, when she was still young, left an indelible mark. He died in a mining accident. A tragedy not uncommon in those perilous pits, but the loss cast the family into immediate hardship. For Mary Ann's mother, raising children alone without the steady wage of a miner meant entering into desperate times. The sudden absence of a father figure and provider may have also planted in Mary Ann an early awareness of how unstable life could be, and how quickly fortune could change. In an age where women had little control over property, wealth, or their own futures, survival often meant attaching oneself to men who could provide. But as Mary Ann would later prove, she saw more than one way to achieve that end. As she grew into adulthood, Mary Ann displayed qualities that made her appear desirable. She was described as attractive by the standards of her day, with dark hair and a composed manner. She worked variously as a nurse and a dressmaker, occupations considered respectable for a young woman of her class. Nursing, in particular, gave her intimate knowledge of illness, symptoms, and medicine. It was a profession that required trust. Patients and families placed their lives in the hands of women like her. But within that knowledge lay the seeds of opportunity, for in Victorian England, the line between healing and poisoning was sometimes razor thin. Arsenic, for example, was widely available in household products, used as a rat poison, and even in certain dyes, meaning that someone with the will to use it maliciously could do so with frightening ease. When Mary Ann married for the first time in her late teens, her life seemed to follow a familiar trajectory for women of her time. She became a housewife, bore children, and worked to keep the home. But from the start, shadows clung to her domestic life. Children born to her often did not survive, succumbing to mysterious stomach ailments that were tragically common in the Victorian age, but would later be reconsidered in light of her eventual crimes. Friends and neighbors may have whispered about the string of misfortunes that followed her. But in a time when child mortality rates were staggeringly high, few would have raised more than a concerned eyebrow. Those early years of marriage revealed something important about Mary Ann. She was restless and ambitious, qualities that could be dangerous in a woman confined to the rigid roles of Victorian society. Marriages brought financial security, but security was fragile. Husbands could fall ill, wages could vanish, and widows often found themselves in dire poverty. For Mary Ann, whose own childhood had been marred by the sudden loss of her father and the financial spiral that followed, the idea of depending entirely on a man's survival may have seemed unbearable. Whether by cold calculation or by some gradual, corrupted reasoning, she began to see a way out of the uncertainty. A dead husband could mean a payout from a life insurance policy. A dead child might reduce the financial burden on the household. Death, rather than being an unavoidable hardship, could become a tool. The young woman who had once been a coal miner's daughter, dressed neatly for Sunday school, and admired for her charm, was steadily reshaping herself into something far darker. By the time she entered her 20s, the pattern of her life, marriage, childbirth, sudden deaths, moves to new towns, was beginning to merge. Each stage of her life carried the outward appearance of normalcy, but behind the veil of respectability lay something chilling. Where others saw tragedy, Mary Ann may have seen only opportunity. Her early experiences in Low Moorsley and the surrounding mining towns explain much about her transformation. It was a world where the death of children was lamented, but hardly surprising, where a miner might be killed in the morning and his family destitute by nightfall, and where the insurance industry was just beginning to offer small policies for the working poor. For someone with enough cunning, those conditions created the perfect backdrop to disguise murder as misfortune. Mary Ann Cotton learned from her earliest days how fragile life was, how money ruled survival, and how appearances could conceal grim realities. It was knowledge she would wield with deadly precision in the years to come. And so the woman, who would later be branded Britain's first female serial killer, began her life not as a monster easily recognized, but as product of her time, ordinary, respectable, and unremarkable. But beneath that ordinary surface, her story was already twisting into something sinister. And soon the deaths around her would no longer be dismissed as coincidence. This was only the beginning of the shadow Mary Ann Cotton cast over Victorian England. Wherever Mary Ann Cotton went, sorrow and death followed in her wake. Yet for years no one suspected that it was anything more than a cruel stroke of fate. In the mid-19th century, disease was rampant, medicine was primitive, and families often buried children, spouses, and parents in rapid succession. Against this backdrop, the losses that seemed to cluster around Mary Ann's life did not immediately appear unusual. But with each move to a new town, each marriage to a new husband, and each addition to her household, the same chilling pattern repeated itself. Healthy individuals would suddenly fall ill, writhing in pain with violent stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea, only to wither away and die in a matter of days. Doctors called it gastric fever, typhoid, or cholera, but the truth was far more sinister. Her first marriage to William Mowbray produced several children, but most did not survive. Neighbors whispered about the string of small coffins leaving the house. But Victorian England was full of such scenes, and grieving parents were more pitied than questioned. Mowbray himself would also die of an unexplained stomach ailment, leaving Mary Ann a widow. In the aftermath, she collected on an insurance policy, a small sum but enough to raise questions if anyone had looked closely. But they did not. Instead, she packed up and moved, carrying her surviving children with her, and beginning again, as though tragedy simply pushed her forward. Her second marriage to George Ward followed much the same course. At first, she appeared to be a devoted wife, nursing him tenderly when he fell ill. Yet the illness lasted for months, draining him slowly until he succumbed to what the attending physician declared a lingering gastric complaint. Ward was young and otherwise healthy, so his death seemed unusual, but no suspicion fell on Mary Ann. On the contrary, her neighbors saw her as a woman unfairly cursed, a figure of pity who was forced to endure loss after loss. What no one realized was that Mary Ann was not cursed at all. She was the curse. Children were particularly vulnerable in her household. Time and again, infants and toddlers developed sudden symptoms of sickness, their little bodies unable to withstand the onslaught. Death certificates recorded them as victims of fever or natural causes, and grieving mothers and fathers were left to accept the terrible whims of fate. But in Mary Ann's case, the pattern was unmistakable. Nearly every child entrusted to her care died, whether her own, her stepchildren, or even those of her partners. At least 11 of her children perished in this way. Each loss folded neatly into the Victorian narrative of high infant mortality. It was a cloak that perfectly concealed her actions. Her relationships also bore the mark of death. After Ward, she married James Robinson, a widower with several children. Within a short time, his young children began to die mysteriously, one after another, all with the same painful symptoms. When his own mother, whom Mary Ann had been nursing, also died suddenly, Robinson began to see the terrible truth. He escaped her grip, casting her out and severing ties before he too became another name on her list. Yet even with his suspicions, no legal action was taken. At the time, the idea of a woman methodically poisoning her own family seemed almost unthinkable. Her marriage to Frederick Cotton brought more of the same. He had children from a previous union, and soon after Mary Ann entered their lives, they began to suffer the same sudden gastric illnesses. Frederick himself did not live long, leaving her widowed again, this time in possession of another modest insurance payout. The pattern was now undeniable to the modern eye, but in her time, it was still cloaked in the tragic normality of disease and misfortune. Each victim became a stepping stone in her relentless march through life, each death a calculated removal of another obstacle between her and financial security. What is chilling is not only the number of deaths that surrounded her, but also the ease with which she moved from one household to another, leaving behind graves and grief, and reinventing herself in new communities as a respectable widow. Her charm and composed manner disguised the darkness beneath, allowing her to insinuate herself into the lives of men who would soon regret ever crossing her path. The black trail she left was not confined to one place, but stretched across towns and counties, a moving cloud of misfortune that seemed to follow her wherever she settled. By the time suspicions began to gather, the count of those who had died around her had risen to staggering levels. 21 individuals were believed to have been poisoned at her hand, though the true number may never be known. The deaths spanned husbands, lovers, children, stepchildren, and even her own mother. It was as if no one was safe from her reach, and the people who should have been protected most fiercely by her care were the very ones she quietly destroyed. What makes her story even more chilling is the way Victorian society itself conspired to protect her, albeit unknowingly. Doctors often accepted her explanations without question, writing gastric fever on death certificates and moving on. Neighbors pitied her as a woman haunted by misfortune, rather than seeing the pattern of death as something unnatural. The prevalence of genuine disease and the lack of modern forensic science gave her the perfect cover. Each death could be explained away, each tragedy folded into the endless tragedies of the time. And yet the repetition of her misfortunes became too much for chance alone to explain. The number of graves associated with her life was beyond even the cruel odds of 19th century survival. Though her victims died quietly in their homes, the combined weight of their absence built an invisible case against her, one that would eventually collapse her carefully constructed facade. In tracing the trail of death that Mary Ann Cotton left behind, it becomes impossible to see her as anything other than a predator cloaked in the guise of a wife, a mother, and a caregiver. She did not kill once in a fit of rage, nor twice in desperation. She killed systematically, repeatedly, and with chilling calculation. Each death was both a means of removing a burden and a chance to secure a financial reward. Each victim's trust became her weapon, and each act of nursing became a rehearsal for murder. The sorrow that followed Mary Ann was no curse, no coincidence. It was the design of a woman who turned tragedy into strategy and who built her life upon the graves of those closest to her. The specter of illness that seemed to follow Mary Ann Cotton had one constant thread woven through it: the unmistakable signs of arsenic poisoning. In the Victorian era, arsenic was everywhere, a substance so common and accessible that it was almost invisible to those who lived among it. It was sold cheaply as a rat poison, mixed into dyes that colored clothing and wallpaper, and even used in small amounts in certain medicines. Housewives kept it in their cupboards without suspicion, and chemists sold it freely without regulation. Its ubiquity made it both an everyday household necessity and, in the wrong hands, the perfect instrument of death. For Mary Ann, it became her weapon of choice, silent and reliable, enabling her to inflict suffering while shrouding herself in the guise of misfortune. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning were cruelly deceptive. Victims would suffer agonizing stomach pains, relentless vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration, symptoms that closely mimicked the deadly diseases of the 19th century, such as cholera and typhoid fever. Doctors, lacking modern diagnostic tools, had little reason to suspect foul play. Death certificates frequently listed gastric fever, a vague term that encompassed a wide range of intestinal ailments. To neighbors and physicians, the death that surrounded Mary Ann appeared tragically ordinary, the result of poor sanitation, tainted water, or the simple bad luck of fragile constitutions. But the repeated, eerily similar patterns in her households told another story, one that was written in arsenic. Mary Ann's familiarity with illness was not accidental. Having worked as a nurse, she possessed enough medical knowledge to understand both the symptoms of disease and the effects of certain substances. She knew how to care for the sick, and she knew what symptoms would be expected if someone were genuinely suffering from gastric fever. By administering arsenic, she could produce those same symptoms with uncanny precision, allowing her to disguise murder as natural illness. In this way, she wielded her nursing experience not to heal but to kill, weaponizing her understanding of the body against those closest to her. What made arsenic particularly advantageous for her purposes was its gradual action. In small doses, it could weaken a victim over days or weeks, leaving them pale, listless, and perpetually ill. This slow decline not only mirrored chronic disease, but also allowed Mary Ann to play the role of attentive caregiver. She could hover by the bedside, mixing food or drink, tending to the suffering, and reinforcing the illusion of her devotion. The deception was complete. To outsiders, she appeared the picture of maternal or wifely sacrifice, mourning each new death with convincing sorrow. All the while, she was the architect of the very misery she pretended to soothe. The true horror of her method was revealed only when suspicions eventually led to exhumations of the bodies of her supposed victims. Tests revealed arsenic present in their tissues, confirming what had once seemed mere coincidence. This revelation cast a grim new light on the long trail of deaths she had left behind. The gastric complaints that had claimed her husbands, children, and other relatives were not cruel twists of fate, but deliberate acts of poisoning. Each convulsion, each fevered cry, each deathbed scene had been orchestrated by her hand. Arsenic also provided her with the advantage of plausible deniability. In Victorian England, accidental poisonings were not rare. Children sometimes ingested it by mistake, mistaking powders or liquids for something harmless. Housewives occasionally mismeasured or mishandled it while attempting to rid their homes of vermin. Against such a backdrop, suspicion was slow to fall on Mary Ann. The very ordinariness of arsenic shielded her, making it seem impossible that so many deaths could be anything other than tragic accidents or the unfortunate realities of an unhealthy age. What is perhaps most chilling is the way she seemed to understand the balance of life and death at her fingertips. Arsenic had to be administered carefully. Too much at once could arouse suspicion by causing sudden violent death. Too little would prolong suffering without ensuring the outcome she desired. Mary Ann appeared to navigate this balance with a sinister precision, ensuring her victims lingered long enough to seem plausibly ill, but not so long as to recover. She dictated the rhythm of their decline, stretching it into a performance of sickness that convinced those around her while hiding her own role as the poisoner. The motives behind her use of arsenic were as pragmatic as they were cold. Insurance money was one obvious incentive. The newly emerging system of industrial life insurance in Victorian England offered small but meaningful payouts for the deaths of working-class men, women, and even children. These policies were designed to cover burial expenses, but in the hands of someone like Mary Ann, they became a perverse opportunity. Time and again, her victims died shortly after policies were secured, their deaths transformed into financial gain. The fact that such insurance was relatively new and poorly regulated meant that few questioned her good fortune in collecting on so many policies. But insurance alone does not fully explain the breadth of her killings. In some cases, she seemed to act as much out of convenience as greed. Children, for example, were costly burdens in a time of economic uncertainty. Each death reduced her responsibilities, lightened her financial load, or cleared the way for new relationships. Husbands who might tire of her demands or fail to provide adequately could be eliminated, freeing her to remarry and repeat the cycle. Arsenic offered her a way to control her circumstances with ruthless efficiency. In a sense, arsenic became an extension of her willpower, a way for her to bend the uncertainties of Victorian life to her advantage. While other women endured the hardships of poverty, widowhood, and child loss as passive victims, Mary Ann turned the same tragedies into a strategy for survival. Her method was horrifying, but it was also chillingly logical in a society that offered women few legitimate means of control over their lives. By poisoning those closest to her, she seized power in a world designed to deny it to her. The image of Mary Ann Cotton, sitting at the bedside of a writhing victim, spoon in hand, is one of calculated cruelty. Each gesture of comfort concealed an act of murder. Each sigh of sorrow disguised satisfaction. In her hands, a common household substance became a tool of terror, transforming ordinary domestic spaces into arenas of quiet destruction. The kitchen, the bedroom, the nursery, all became stages for her deadly art. When forensic evidence finally revealed the presence of arsenic in the remains of her victims, it shattered the illusion that had protected her for so long. No longer could the deaths be dismissed as unfortunate coincidence. Science, still in its infancy, provided the undeniable proof that human malice, not fate, had claimed these lives. For Mary Ann, the very substance that had given her power and anonymity became the key to her downfall, exposing the monstrous truths behind her veil of respectability. In the end, arsenic was both her greatest ally and her ultimate undoing. The deaths that surrounded Mary Ann Cotton were not random, nor were they simply the work of a woman driven by madness without reason. There was always a grim practicality to her actions, and at the center of it all lay the lure of money and the fragile security it promised in a world where poverty was a constant shadow. To understand why she poisoned so many, one must look at the economic realities of 19th century England, where the rise of industrial life insurance and the hardships of working-class families collided in a way that gave someone like Mary Ann both motive and opportunity. The Industrial Revolution had transformed England by the mid-1800s, but for the working poor, the benefits were meager. Life in mining towns and factory districts was hard, wages were low, and the risks of sudden death or injury were high. Families lived on the edge of survival, with little to fall back on if the primary wage earner was lost. It was in this climate that small life insurance policies became popular among the laboring classes. Companies offered affordable premiums, promising payouts that could cover funeral expenses or, in some cases, leave behind a small cushion for widows and children. These policies were modest by modern standards, but for someone scraping by week to week, they could mean the difference between destitution and a chance to begin again. Mary Ann understood the system all too well. Each of her marriages was marked by a curious coincidence. Shortly before her husbands fell ill, policies were taken out or updated. When they died, she collected the insurance money, a sum that might have looked small in the eyes of wealthier families, but which represented a significant windfall for her. These payments allowed her to move, to remarry, and to maintain an appearance of stability despite the tragedies that dogged her steps. It was, in a macabre sense, her livelihood, a business model built on the steady elimination of those closest to her. But insurance money was only one piece of her motivation. There was also the matter of children. In an age when large families were common, each child represented both love and burden. Feeding, clothing, and housing so many mouths was a constant strain. For Mary Ann, whose own early life had been marked by poverty after her father's death, the cost of raising children may have felt like chains around her survival. Time and again, when her households grew crowded with children, whether her own or those of new husbands, deaths began to occur. Infants and young ones sickened suddenly, their deaths easing the weight on her shoulders. It is hard to imagine a colder calculation, but the pattern suggests that for her, children could be discarded as easily as husbands when they no longer served her needs. There is also a darker emotional layer to consider. Mary Ann seemed restless, never satisfied with the lives she constructed. She married frequently, moved often, and was always seeking a new beginning. Yet with each start came complications. A husband who did not earn enough, children who drained her energy, mothers-in-law or relatives who were inconvenient. Poisoning allowed her to reset her circumstances whenever they became intolerable. The deaths she engineered were not always about money in a straightforward sense. They were also about freedom, about clearing the slate so she could try again elsewhere, unburdened by those who tied her down. Her calculated approach becomes clear when examining the timing of many of the deaths. They often coincided with her financial struggles. When her first husband, William Mowbray, died, she collected on a policy and used the money to support herself. With her second husband, George Ward, she again received financial benefit. By the time she married Frederick Cotton, her pattern was entrenched. Secure a policy, ensure the husband's decline, and walk away with both sympathy and a payout. Even beyond her husbands, she targeted those whose deaths would lighten her load or produce small financial rewards, whether from parish relief, inheritance, or the absence of dependence. In this light, Mary Ann Cotton appears less like a figure driven by uncontrollable impulses and more like a cold strategist, someone who saw human lives in terms of financial and personal advantage. She was not driven by passion in the way some killers are portrayed, nor by blind hatred. Her crimes were chilling precisely because they were practical. To her, a life could be measured against an insurance policy, a household budget, or a personal inconvenience. If the equation did not balance, death was the solution. This pragmatic cruelty also explains why she continued for so long without being caught. In an age when women were seen primarily as caretakers, it was nearly unthinkable that a mother could deliberately harm her children, or that a wife could poison her husband for money. Society assumptions shielded her, allowing her to play the part of the grieving widow or heartbroken mother again and again. Each death brought her not only financial relief, but also sympathy and support from the community. She could cry genuine-looking tears at funerals, and people would offer condolences, never imagining that her sorrow was a mask for satisfaction. What makes her motives especially chilling is how ordinary they were. Mary Ann did not seek vast wealth or power. She was not attempting to ascend to the upper classes or to make her name known. Her ambitions were modest by any standard: a small insurance payout, a lighter household burden, the freedom to start over in a new place. These were the goals of countless ordinary Victorians, yet she pursued them by extraordinary and terrible means. The banality of her motive, simple financial security, makes her story all the more disturbing. Her case also reflects the broader anxieties of her era. Life insurance was still new, and while it promised dignity in death, it also introduced the unsettling possibility of murder for profit. Newspapers of the time seized upon her crimes not only because of the sheer body count, but because they highlighted a terrifying flaw in a system meant to protect families. If a woman could poison her children and husbands for a handful of pounds, what did that say about the safety of this modern innovation? Mary Ann Cotton became a symbol not only of personal wickedness, but of the darker side of industrial society, where money and survival were so tightly bound that even the most sacred bonds of family could be corrupted. As her life unfolded, the pattern of death and financial gain became too obvious to ignore. Each husband buried, each child lost, each payment collected, chipped away at the illusion of tragic coincidence. The motives that once lay hidden in the practical needs of daily survival began to reveal themselves as calculated greed and cold convenience. When suspicions finally caught up with her, the picture that emerged was not of a helpless widow, but of a woman who had turned death itself into a trade, making victims of those who trusted her most. In the end, the motive of money and convenience was both her driving force and the rope that eventually tightened around her neck. The mask Mary Ann Cotton wore for so many years began to slip, not because of some sudden confession or an extraordinary leap in forensic science, but because her pattern of cold practicality finally drew too much attention. By the early 1870s, she had already left behind a trail of dead husbands, children, and relatives. But her movements from one town to another, her ability to remarry quickly, and the frequent explanations of gastric fever or typhoid had protected her from closer scrutiny. Still, whispers were starting to follow her, and suspicion was beginning to harden into certainty. What had once been accepted as tragic coincidence was becoming too obvious to ignore. The same stories repeated themselves wherever she went: a new husband or companion, new dependence, sudden illness, swift decline, and death. Yet even then it took one careless comment from Mary Ann herself to finally unravel the terrible web she had spun. When she became involved with a man named Frederick Cotton after the death of her third husband, she assumed yet another new life. With him came children from a previous marriage, and soon the familiar pattern returned. The Cotton household began to shrink, one death at a time, until Frederick himself also perished, leaving Mary Ann with the insurance money and the responsibility of the surviving children. But instead of the sympathy she had received so often before, her behavior began to alarm those around her. She openly complained about the burden of raising Frederick's children and spoke with chilling indifference about their futures. The turning point came when she was living with Frederick's sister and was receiving financial help from a local parish official named Thomas Riley. When Riley asked about the welfare of one of Frederick's surviving sons, Charles Edward, Mary Ann allegedly remarked that the boy had to die before she could receive parish relief. It was a strikingly brazen statement, one that peeled away the mask of grief she usually wore and revealed something darker. Riley was horrified, and for the first time, someone in authority refused to dismiss her misfortunes as bad luck. He carried his suspicions forward, watching closely and refusing to let her words be forgotten. Shortly after, young Charles Edward fell gravely ill, suffering the same agonizing symptoms of stomach pain, vomiting, and weakness that had claimed so many others in her care. His decline was rapid, and his death was written off as gastric fever. But Riley, unwilling to let go of his suspicions, reported her to the authorities. For the first time in Mary Ann's long career of hidden murder, the machinery of justice began to turn against her. The authorities ordered an inquest into Charles Edward's death, and suspicion quickly spread to the other deaths in her household. An autopsy revealed the unmistakable presence of arsenic in the child's body. With that discovery, the veil of coincidence that had shielded her crumbled. It was not just one child who had died mysteriously, but many. And the evidence in his body provided the scientific proof that her acts were deliberate. The case against her began to build with frightening clarity. The press seized on the story with relish. Victorian England was captivated by tales of crime, and the idea of a respectable-looking woman, a wife and mother, poisoning her way through 21 lives shocked the public imagination. Newspapers painted her as both monstrous and fascinating, a woman who had turned domestic life, the supposed heart of morality and virtue, into a hunting ground. For weeks, her name was splashed across headlines, and the horror of her deeds became a national obsession. Mary Ann herself did not help her case. Though she had once been skilled at playing the grieving widow, under the weight of suspicion, she faltered. She denied the accusations, but her history betrayed her. Each dead husband, each child buried, each policy collected, became a piece of evidence in the minds of the public, even if not all could be formally proven in court. The sheer weight of coincidence was enough to damn her reputation, and the arsenic found in Charles Edward's body sealed her legal fate. The trial that followed in 1873 drew widespread attention. Mary Ann was charged with the murder of young Charles Edward, though the implication was clear that this was only one of many such crimes. In court, the prosecution laid out the evidence of arsenic poisoning and highlighted her suspicious history of repeated bereavements, marriages, and insurance payouts. Witnesses, including Thomas Riley, testified to her callous remarks and strange behavior, while her defense tried to argue that the deaths were the result of disease. The tide of opinion was already against her. The jury was presented not only with the medical evidence, but with the chilling possibility that Mary Ann Cotton had been quietly killing for years. For Victorian society, the image of Mary Ann on trial was profoundly unsettling. Women were expected to embody morality, to nurture children, and support their families. The idea that a woman could systematically destroy her own kin for profit shattered deeply held beliefs about gender and domestic life. She became not just a murderer, but a symbol of inverted motherhood and corrupted womanhood, the antithesis of everything respectable society claimed to hold dear. That she had been able to operate undetected for so long only deepened the sense of horror and fascination. When the verdict of guilty was returned, it was almost inevitable. She was sentenced to death by hanging at Durham jail. The execution was a spectacle, drawing a crowd eager to witness the downfall of the woman who had haunted England's imagination for months. On March 24, 1873, Mary Ann Cotton faced the gallows. Accounts say the execution was botched. The drop was miscalculated, and she suffered a slow strangulation rather than a swift death. In the eyes of many, it was a fittingly grim end for a woman who had inflicted so much suffering on others. Her downfall was not only the product of forensic science catching up to her, or of one careless statement overheard by a parish official. It was the culmination of years of suspicion finally coalescing into certainty. The moment when coincidence could no longer disguise intent. The repeated tragedies that had once inspired sympathy had become too numerous, too patterned, too sinister to ignore. In the end, Mary Ann Cotton was exposed not by a single mistake, but by the accumulation of all her crimes pressing down upon her until the truth could no longer be denied. Her capture and trial marked the moment when the carefully constructed facade she had maintained for decades was finally destroyed, leaving only the monstrous reality beneath. Mary Ann Cotton's trial and eventual execution in 1873 were not just the conclusion of one woman's murderous career, but the moment her story was cemented into the fabric of British criminal history. For weeks before her hanging, she had been the subject of fascination in the press, her name whispered with equal parts horror and awe across the country. She was not the first killer to stalk Victorian England, but she was one of the first women to be accused of killing with such ruthless calculation. And that made her case stand out in an age when female criminality was rarely acknowledged on such a scale. Her trial at Durham created a storm of interest, and her public execution was attended with the morbid curiosity that often surrounded such events in the 19th century. People came to see the woman who had supposedly poisoned her way through more than 20 lives, and the newspapers painted her as a monster in petticoats, a woman who had turned the natural instincts of wifehood and motherhood into something grotesque. The execution itself became part of her legend. On March 24, 1873, she was led to the gallows at Durham jail, dressed in the plain garments of a condemned prisoner. The executioner miscalculated the drop, and instead of a swift death, Mary Ann was said to have struggled and strangled for several moments before life finally left her body. This botched hanging, brutal and drawn out, only added to the grim fascination surrounding her. The woman who had poisoned so many with slow, agonizing deaths now suffered her own slow passing, and for the public watching, it was seen as a kind of poetic justice. The execution was not only the end of her life, but the beginning of her afterlife as one of Britain's most infamous figures. Her legacy was complex, shaped as much by the Victorian press as by the facts of her crimes. Newspapers at the time delighted in sensationalizing her story, dubbing her the West Auckland Banshee and the Black Widow. They emphasized her femininity as much as her brutality, casting her as an unnatural woman who had perverted her role in the home. The fascination lay not only in the number of her victims, but in the contradiction she embodied. A mother was supposed to protect her children, a wife was supposed to cherish her husband, and yet Mary Ann had done the opposite, turning hearth and home into her killing ground. In doing so, she became a symbol of everything that terrified Victorians about the possibility of evil lurking within the domestic sphere. Her case also left its mark on the way people thought about life insurance. The rise of affordable policies for the working classes had been seen as a blessing, a way to ease the burden of funerals and provide a little relief for grieving families. But Mary Ann Cotton exposed the dark side of the system, the possibility that life itself could be commodified, turned into a financial transaction worth more in death than in life. Her exploitation of this system raised fears that others might follow her example, and for a time, it cast a shadow of suspicion over the entire institution. Families, neighbors, and even parish officials began to look more closely at those who seemed to suffer too many convenient deaths, and the insurance industry faced growing scrutiny. In this way, Mary Ann's crimes had an effect that rippled far beyond her own household, reshaping public awareness of how money and murder could be intertwined. Beyond the newspapers and insurance debates, Mary Ann Cotton became part of folklore. Songs were written about her, with ballads passed down that recounted her crimes in darkly humorous or cautionary tones. In the northeast of England, children would chant verses about her, keeping her name alive long after her body was laid in the ground. Her story blended fact and exaggeration, turning her into a figure of almost mythical wickedness, a bogey woman invoked to frighten children or to caution against greed. The reality of her victims, the husbands, the children, the relatives who suffered under her hand, was sometimes overshadowed by the theatrical image she became in popular imagination. But that, too, was part of her legacy. She was transformed into a cultural figure, remembered not as a human being, but as an embodiment of female monstrosity. Historians have since debated the true scale of her crimes. While she was convicted of a single murder, the poisoning of young Charles Edward Cotton, contemporary investigators suspected her of killing as many as 21 people. Some estimates place the number even higher, though precise evidence is scarce, given the limitations of forensic science in the 1800s. Arsenic was everywhere in Victorian households, in rat poison, wallpaper, cosmetics, and medicines. Detecting it in the body was possible, but difficult, and not every grave could be exhumed or examined. The lack of definitive proof for every suspected victim means that part of her story will always remain in the shadowy realm of speculation. What is certain, however, is that she was willing to kill more than once, and her method was systematic enough to suggest a long, deliberate campaign of murder. Her place in history is also significant because she was a woman. Male serial killers, even in the 19th century, could be imagined within certain cultural frameworks: cruel husbands, violent brutes, or twisted predators. But Mary Ann Cotton challenged the very idea of femininity in Victorian England. She was proof that a woman could kill not in a moment of passion, but with calculation and patience, stretching her crimes across decades. This made her uniquely terrifying to her contemporaries, and it is part of why she remains such a notorious figure today. She represented not only murder, but the betrayal of the deepest societal expectations about women, family, and home. In modern times, her name has reemerged in books, television documentaries, and academic studies about the history of crime and gender. She is often cited as Britain's first known female serial killer, a title that secures her a permanent place in the annals of criminology. Researchers continue to dissect her life, her motives, and the cultural context that allowed her to operate for so long without serious suspicion. She is sometimes presented as a case study in the intersection of poverty, gender, and crime. How a woman trapped in the economic hardships of her time might find perverse empowerment through murder. Others view her more simply as a remorseless killer who chose convenience and greed over the sanctity of human life. Whether seen as a product of her environment or as a singularly monstrous figure, Mary Ann Cotton endures in the public imagination. Her story is a chilling reminder of how evil can wear ordinary faces, how trust can be exploited, and how the very structures meant to support families, marriage, motherhood, insurance, can be twisted into tools of destruction. The housewife, who was supposed to embody the virtues of the age, instead became a specter haunting it, a woman who poisoned not only her victims, but the very idea of safety within the home. Her execution closed her life but opened a legend, and that legend continues to echo more than a century later. Mary Ann Cotton's legacy is not just that of a woman who killed, but of a society forced to confront the possibility that even the most ordinary figure could hide extraordinary darkness. In death, she became more than a criminal. She became a symbol of betrayal, greed, and the macabre shadow that can lurk behind the most familiar face. In the end, Mary Ann Cotton's story remains one of the most chilling chapters in Britain's dark history.